Why am I here if everything ends? It's a question that doesn't shout. It whispers. In the middle of a quiet morning, after the applause has faded, or when you're alone with the ceiling and your thoughts. Tolstoy had everything, and yet he wanted to disappear. When the soul no longer feels the pulse of purpose, even success becomes a tomb. There comes a moment when the mind cannot distract itself anymore, and silence becomes unbearable. That's where Tolstoy began, not with an answer, but with collapse. There's a particular kind of collapse that doesn't look like falling. It happens quietly, while everyone else is clapping. That's how it began for Tolstoy, not with tragedy, but with triumph. He had reached what most people spend their lives chasing: success, legacy, love. His name echoed across continents. His novels redefined literature. His estate overflowed with the signs of a perfect life. But in the middle of it all, a question emerged, not loud, not dramatic, but devastating in its clarity. Why live if death waits for everything? That question didn't come from pain, came from silence. A silence he couldn't unhear, a silence that didn't scream, but hollowed him out from the inside. He described it as a sickness of the spirit, a slow, creeping awareness that no matter how much he achieved, no matter how much he loved or created, everything would eventually vanish. Every face he cherished would fade. Every word he wrote would turn to dust. Every tree, every structure, every triumph temporary. And so, each morning, he woke up under the weight of an invisible question mark. What's the point of it all? If it all disappears, it wasn't a crisis of success. It was a crisis of meaning, the deepest kind, the kind that seeps into the bones, when life no longer makes sense, even when it's beautiful. He tried to ignore it, to distract himself with pleasures, with routines, with work. He threw himself into life, hoping motion would substitute for purpose. But the question waited for him at night, in the quiet, in the in-between spaces where the soul is most exposed. The world applauded, but inside, he was unraveling. What is the point of writing books if everyone who reads them will die? What is the point of being good if goodness can't stop the grave? Why build anything if time will erase it all? He wasn't being cynical. He was being honest, brutally honest. And honesty, when stripped of illusion, often looks like despair. This was the paradox. The man who wrote War and Peace no longer knew what peace meant. The man who understood characters so intimately no longer understood his own reason for living. He confessed that he feared holding a rope in case he might hang himself, not because he wanted to die, but because he no longer knew how to live. The applause had become a prison, the intellect a maze. The pleasures of life tasted like ash. And so, Tolstoy stepped into the most dangerous journey a human can take, the search for meaning when logic has collapsed. What he discovered changed his life, and still speaks to ours. Because many today are standing exactly where Tolstoy once stood, with everything on the outside and nothing on the inside. If you've ever felt that quiet dread beneath your routine, the ache behind your smile, you're not alone. You're not broken. You're just finally asking the question most people spend their lives avoiding. They say the most dangerous illusion is the one that looks like success. Tolstoy had everything: respect, wealth, family, a legacy that most writers would die for. He wasn't chasing meaning in the middle of failure. He was suffocating in the middle of perfection. From the outside, he was a man who had won the game of life. But inside, he was quietly falling apart. And perhaps that's the cruelest form of suffering, the kind you can't explain because everything looks fine. He began to notice something terrifying, that the applause he received was not reaching him, that the joy he should be feeling had been replaced by a dull, unshakable numbness, that each day was a repetition of the last, and each victory tasted less like triumph and more like anesthesia. He wrote, "Happiness was just a disguise I wore to survive the emptiness." That sentence was not crafted for effect. It was a confession. He wasn't just asking what the meaning of life was. He was asking why it no longer felt like he was living at all. And yet, no one saw it, because we're taught to measure a life by its achievements, not by its aliveness. We ask, "What have you built?" But never, "Are you still whole inside?" Tolstoy's crisis began in that invisible fracture, the moment when your outer world and inner world stop matching. When the image succeeds, but the soul begins to rot in silence. He walked through rooms filled with admiration, yet felt completely alone. He played with his children, yet feared for their future emptiness. He saw his wife's love, yet couldn't feel it. The joy was still there, but it was untouchable, as if glass separated him from his own life. This wasn't drama. It was a quiet death of meaning. And in many ways, it's the death we don't talk about, the one that happens slowly in the lives of people who seem to have it all. We often think pain is loud, but the most dangerous kind, whispers, tells you to keep smiling, to keep going, to not ruin it for others. And so you shrink, silently, until one day you realize you've become a stranger in your own skin. Tolstoy realized he had reached a place few dare to admit, the top with nothing left to climb. And from that height, all he could see was the absurdity of it all. He had written characters with meaning, but couldn't write meaning into his own story. That irony cut deeply. The man who captured the fullness of human experience no longer knew how to experience himself. And that's where the unraveling truly began. Not in the loss of anything external, but in the unbearable presence of everything, without the one thing that mattered, a reason to stay alive. Tolstoy was not ignorant. He was a thinker, perhaps too much of one. And that became part of the problem. When the heart goes silent, the mind gets louder. It starts trying to fix what it can't feel. It searches for formulas, answers, systems, hoping logic will provide what life has stopped offering. A reason to keep going. But what if reason is the very thing that traps you? Tolstoy turned to philosophy, to science, to ideologies and intellectual frameworks. He devoured the works of Socrates, Buddha, Solomon. He looked for a blueprint, coherent answer, a sentence that would silence the scream. But each book left him more empty. Each idea, however elegant, collapsed under the weight of his despair. He began to see something terrifying. That reason, when left alone, becomes a beautifully crafted prison. It explains everything, except the one thing we truly need to understand: why to live at all. He wrote that the more he understood the laws of nature, the more meaningless life appeared. Evolution told him he was an accident. Biology told him he was decaying matter. History told him he was forgettable. And philosophy, well, philosophy only deepened the contradiction. He described it like standing on a cliff and realizing that reason had built the very ledge he now wanted to jump from. The more he understood life intellectually, the less he felt connected to it emotionally. "Happy is he who has not been born," he wrote, echoing ancient wisdom. And perhaps that was the core of his suffering, that the mind could analyze everything, but heal nothing. This is the wound of the overthinker, the person who lives in their head, searching for meaning with the wrong tools. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be carried, lived, felt. But Tolstoy wasn't ready to surrender yet. His mind still believed it could outthink the darkness. And so he spiraled. He obsessed. He dissected every emotion, every belief, every structure of life. But the more he broke things down, the less whole he became. It's a paradox many intellectuals face, that the deeper you go into knowledge, the more you risk losing the thread of simple aliveness. Children don't ask why life matters. They play, they cry, they live. But adults, wounded by abstraction, begin to ask not from curiosity but from grief. Tolstoy was grieving, not a person, not an event, but the absence of something unnameable. And he had reached a truth that scared him, that pure thought without faith or feeling leads not to clarity, but to despair. His brilliant mind had become a weapon turned inward, and the more he tried to think his way out, the deeper he sank. Sometimes the soul doesn't need an answer. It needs permission to feel lost. There's a story Tolstoy once told, not just to the world, but to himself. A man is running from a wild beast. In desperation, he jumps into a dry well to escape. But at the bottom of the well, a dragon waits, jaws wide open. Mid-air, the man clutches a branch growing from the wall. Above him, the beast still prowls. Below him, the dragon breathes. He's suspended between terror and death. And then he sees it. 2 drops of honey resting on the leaves of the branch. He reaches out and tastes them. That's the story. And Tolstoy saw himself in every part of it. The beast above was his fear of existence, the senselessness, the weight of being. The dragon below was death, always waiting. And the honey, the fleeting pleasures of life, art, love, laughter, food, sex, distraction. Sweet, but temporary. It was a brutal, honest metaphor. A man hanging in a meaningless universe, moments from collapse, choosing instead to lick something sweet, just to forget where he was. Tolstoy began asking, how much of my joy is real, and how much is just sugar coating the fear? The metaphor haunted him, because he saw how modern life, even then, was built around honey. We chase pleasure not because we're alive, but because we're afraid of feeling dead. We scroll, we drink, we perform, we consume. We taste the honey while ignoring the abyss below. Pleasure becomes survival, but pleasure without purpose becomes poison. Tolstoy started to see his entire life through this lens. His writing, applause. His family, stability. His estate, comfort. But none of it could stop the dread. None of it could rescue him from the suspended state between 2 inevitabilities, the chaos of life and the certainty of death. He realized that most people aren't truly living, they're just prolonging distraction. The honey, no matter how sweet, couldn't erase the fact that he was hanging by a thread. And this is where his despair deepened, because once you taste the illusion and see through it, you can't go back. He couldn't enjoy the sweetness anymore, because he knew what it was hiding. This story wasn't just a parable. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, Tolstoy saw a truth that many avoid their entire lives. That sometimes, joy isn't a sign of meaning. It's a mask for fear. He wasn't condemning pleasure. He was simply tired of mistaking it for peace. He didn't want to lick honey anymore. He wanted to climb out. But to do that, he had to stop pretending it was enough. The world around him still celebrated sweetness. But inside, he was learning to live without it. He stopped reading and started watching. Tolstoy, exhausted by his own mind, turned his gaze outward, not to the philosophers, but to the peasants who worked his land, men and women who had far less than him, but seemed to carry something he had lost: faith. It wasn't the kind that came from dogma. It was lived in the dirt, in the cold, in the rhythm of survival. It wasn't about theology. It was about a quiet certainty, an invisible anchor beneath the storms of life. They suffered, yet didn't despair. They aged, yet didn't panic. They had nothing, yet they sang. Tolstoy, with all his brilliance, all his questions, all his wealth, had no such peace. And this realization broke him open. He began to see that maybe the meaning of life wasn't something you discover. Maybe it's something you embody. Maybe it's not thought, but presence. Not intellect, but surrender. He saw a strength in them that had nothing to do with knowledge. Came from somewhere else, somewhere beneath words. For the first time, he questioned the authority of his own mind. How could people who suffered more feel more peace? How could people with less certainty live with more trust? How could the ones who had lost so much walk with so little fear? The answer, he realized, had nothing to do with argument, and everything to do with surrender. Not the weak kind, not giving up, but the sacred kind, letting go of control. This was the turning point. He had spent years trying to conquer meaning like a fortress. But what if meaning didn't come from conquest? What if it came from kneeling, from being small in front of something vast? The peasants didn't have answers. They had relationship to the land, to each other, to something infinite. And for the first time, Tolstoy allowed himself to feel that maybe he didn't have to figure it all out. Maybe peace isn't the conclusion of a question. Maybe it's the silence that remains when you stop asking. It was the poor who taught him that the soul doesn't need clarity. it needs grounding. That truth isn't always spoken. It's lived in how you carry water, how you face loss, how you hold your children when you have no words. He, the intellectual, had studied everything, but they had trusted life itself. That kind of trust wasn't built in books. It was built in fire, and it was in their fire that Tolstoy found warmth. Not an answer, but a path. Not certainty, but the courage to keep walking. Not the end of doubt, but the beginning of humility. And sometimes that's all a soul needs. Not to be filled, but to stop pretending it's empty. Tolstoy saw that there are only a few ways humans deal with the terror of meaninglessness, and he tried them all. The first is distraction. You fill your life with tasks, ambitions, noise. You keep moving so you don't have to feel. You live by the calendar. You stay busy. You scroll. You build. But when the noise fades, the silence is louder, and the truth returns. Tolstoy had filled his life with noise. Writing, teaching, politics, parenting, but none of it stopped the ache, because distraction doesn't heal. It delays. The second path is pleasure, what philosophers call Epicureanism. You indulge. You pursue joy, beauty, sex, food, art, travel. And for a while, it works. Honey on the tongue. But eventually, you realize pleasure can't carry the weight of your soul. It wasn't designed to. Tolstoy watched people drown in indulgence, chasing highs to escape lows, and he saw himself among them. The more they consumed, the emptier they became. Not because joy is wrong, but because when you treat it like a substitute for meaning, it rots. The third path is despair, giving up. Some do it dramatically, others silently. Tolstoy considered it, not once, but many times. He feared holding ropes. He avoided walking alone in forests. He confessed this in his writings, not to glorify the thought, but to admit its power. When life feels absurd and nothing matters, the idea of ending it can start to feel rational. But he stopped himself, because deep down, something still wanted to live, even if it didn't know why yet. The fourth path is the most common: paralysis. You do nothing. You float. You keep breathing, but you've stopped truly living. You're not distracted. You're not indulging. You're not in crisis. You're just numb, waiting, hoping something external will save you, hoping meaning will arrive like a letter in the mail. But it never does. This state, Tolstoy wrote, is the most dangerous, because it masquerades as survival, but it's spiritual starvation. You're not choosing death, but you're not choosing life either. He had been there. That fog, that gray zone, that slow drift where days blur and time becomes weight. It's not pain that kills you there. It's the absence of feeling altogether. So where do you go when all four paths fail? That's the question Tolstoy faced, not in theory, but in the quiet of his own life. And it's the same question many face today, silently. When distraction numbs, pleasure fades, despair knocks, and numbness spreads, what's left? For Tolstoy, the answer didn't come with force. It came with surrender. He stopped trying to escape the question and began to live inside it. And in that surrender, something unexpected emerged. Not the meaning of life, but the willingness to live without needing to understand it. Sometimes, the only way forward is to stop looking for the door and just sit with yourself in the dark until your eyes adjust. He didn't find an answer, not the kind you can underline in a book, not the kind you can explain in words. What Tolstoy found was peace, not in success, not in logic, not in applause, but in something quieter, something older, something beneath all thought. He began to give things away, his money, his comfort, his certainty. He began to live less for admiration and more for alignment, less for legacy and more for presence. He stopped trying to solve life and started to serve it. He walked away from the identity he had built, the intellectual, the nobleman, the author, and in that walking away, he became whole. He once wrote, "As long as I sought answers, I was restless. But when I learned to kneel, I could finally sleep." This was not defeat. This was return. Return to simplicity, to silence, to that sacred humility where life is no longer a question, but a companion. He lived the rest of his days close to the land, close to the people, and closer than ever to the parts of himself he had once exiled. The noise that had tormented him began to soften, not because the questions vanished, but because he no longer needed to control them. Perhaps peace isn't what you find. Perhaps peace is what remains when you stop searching. We are raised to chase meaning as if it's a finish line, as if one day, if we do everything right, we'll wake up and know. But maybe the knowing doesn't come from answers. Maybe it comes from participation, from being here, from holding your sorrow without trying to fix it, from being kind even when nothing makes sense, from trusting not that life is easy, but that it's enough. Tolstoy gave us something more valuable than a solution. He gave us permission to stop pretending we have to figure it all out, to step out of the mind's maze, to sit with the mystery, to walk through life with reverence, even when the map is blank. And maybe that's where it begins, not with clarity, but with surrender, not with having more, but needing less, not with becoming someone, but finally coming home to yourself. If you've ever felt that aching emptiness, that quiet disorientation inside a life that looks fine on the outside, you're not alone. You're in the presence of a question, a sacred one, and the way forward is not to escape it, but to honor it. Because maybe the most meaningful lives are not the ones with the most answers, but the ones lived slowly, softly, willingly, even when nothing makes sense. Are you ready to stop searching and start listening? Are you ready to live even when you don't understand? If this message touched something deep in you, write in the comments. Let it be unknown. And if your path feels quiet lately, that might not be emptiness. It might be life asking you to finally sit down, stay a while, let the silence speak.